Hey, as we discussed in the Beginner's Guide to Team Comps yesterday, I'm going to be doing a series on each of the team comps, or at least all the ones I can think of. And we're going to start here today with the Beginner's Guide to Dwarfs. And we're going to be going over, what the dwarfs are in Storybook Brawl, how you want to build the comp, what might cause you to get in it, and just some other considerations when playing for this build. So, first of all, what are sort of the characteristics of the dwarves? They're probably the simplest comp in the entire game. You just buy a bunch of dwarfs for the most part, and gives you a lot of stats. I got my first 2 to 3 wins in Storybook Brawl came with dwarf comps, and I think that's because it's just sort of the easiest one to understand, and it, sort of always gives you a power level that's relatively similar by the end of the game, and oftentimes that's enough to take down the lobby. So, what are the different dwarfs available? Let's just go through them real quick. Tiny is a 2 gold character. It's just a 6/1, which means it will, you know, mostly when it attacks, it will take down anything early in the game, barring some kind of eeny meeny miny mo on a Humpty, although it is sort of the bane of Humpties. When people do break that out, that's not often seen. It loses to Cat, the Black Cat, and it can lose to the Shorewood Sure Shot, although that's just something, because that's range, that tends to win over some things. It's, just a vanilla stats. It's fine to get in your comp if you can't find something better, because we usually trade. It's not exciting, and it's certainly not a reason you'd go towards dwarfs. If you buy a tiny early, don't feel like you're going towards dwarfs, because that's not a signal at all. Crafty is just a 1/1 that gets +3/+3 for every treasure you have. When it's upgraded, it will get +6/+6. So it can get pretty sizable if you have early treasures. Sometimes you'll notice with like Wonder Waddle or I don't know if there's other characters that treasure super easily, but Wonder Waddle specifically, I notice, because it only takes 2 things to treasure, you might end up with a few extra treasures, and you might end up buying a random Crafty as a 7/7. If you happen to get 3 of them too, it gives you a treasure and gets the +6/+6, so it becomes sort of an 8/8 out of the box. But since it's a 1/1 early on, it's pretty weak. The average is 2/2 of stats, and if you can buy it as a 2-cost 4/4, maybe you'll go into that. But again, Crafty isn't the reason you're getting into dwarfs, and in general, you shouldn't base your team comp on what you buy in the first couple turns, because those are not minions that usually are characters that usually build around, and they're so weak that they're just so easily replaced by 3s and 4s and 5s and 6s that getting attached to your 2 gold characters is going to be a trap most of the time. Fanny is one of those things that sort of leads you down the trap phase sometimes, because Fanny is actually a very powerful support if you have 2 dwarfs in front of it. Getting 2/2 in stats is generally stronger than getting the +3 attack or just the +3 health that you'd get from a Mad Mims or a Baby Root. However, those other supports end up being a lot stronger because they, especially Mad Mims, helps activate a lot of Slay characters early on, especially the Kitty Cut Purse and the Adventurer. Sometimes Brave Princess also. Baby Root can make something like a Trojan Donkey take more hits and help survive. And those end up being a lot more versatile because you can switch out the characters in front of them very easily. Fanny's very strong if you happen to have 2 dwarfs. Unfortunately, the other early dwarfs we looked at, Tiny and Crafty, are very weak. So it's hard to build an early comp around Fanny, which means oftentimes if you see her, you might just end up buying her as a 2/2. And if you get 2 of them, you'll just put one in front and have it be a 4/4 and a 2/2. And that's a reasonable setup for just 2 characters, but in general, Fanny, again, isn't something you'll get into Dwarfs well, but if you happen to see one in the mid game, and oftentimes with Dwarfs, you're going to end up just trying to buy all the Dwarfs, so if you happen to see one mid game, you might pick her up, and she might be pretty valuable. Lucky is a character that has a last breath that reduces the cost of a random character in your next shop by 2 gold. So, when you get Lucky, you're usually still on the level 3 or level 4, which means that you're reducing the cost of a 4, 3, or 2 cost minion by 2. If you reduce a 2 cost minion by 2, you can just pick that up for free and sell it and get a free gold. So in that sense, it's, just a last breath give you a gold. And that's fine. That would be pretty powerful. It's just a 3/2. It has terrible combat stats. If it happens to hit the character you want to buy, it gives you plus 2 gold. And that can be very, very powerful. Getting 2 gold, the reason people keep kitty cut purses around is because getting that extra gold, especially early in the game, can really help bump up your curve. Usually you have sort of a gold curve in a pattern of what you're going to buy. It can help you afford an extra spell, an extra minion, or, a couple high, if you hit 4s, it can get 2 4s instead of just 1. So there are some things that work, but in general it's pretty weak, and it has no dwarf synergies itself, so it's not going to push you into dwarfs either. Tweedledee is actually probably the first dwarf, or maybe other than Tiny, that you might buy just because it's a body. It's a 4/1, and when it has its last breath, it turns into a 1/4. This means it plays well with supports, it plays well with Fanny, but it also plays well with, either Mad Mims or Baby Root even, because each side of it sort of plays differently. You either have a 7/1 then a 4/4, or you have a 4/4 then a 1/7. The Mad Mims is probably more powerful with it, but either way, you get some benefit. It also has the benefit of, playing well with Princess White, because it dies twice and boosts her twice. I think Tweedledee is one of the stronger just dwarfs when you're not part of the comp. So sometimes when you're starting a dwarf comp, you won't make the transition because of Tweedledee, but you might find yourself having Tweedledee just lying around because it's a decent body at sometimes early in the game. When you get to when you first hit level 3, often you'll have 5 gold, and you'll want to just buy a level 3 and a level 2. And if you don't generally want to spend a lot of gold rolling to look for better level 3s, just because the cost of rolling, on 5 gold is 20% of your gold. So you often just want to spend as much. So you might just pick up a Tweedledee as, it's a random 3, which is better than, better in combat than all the 2s. I guess it was just a Humpty, but in general. So that's something to consider. Other than that, it's a pretty simple character. Doubly is an interesting character. It's the most important, second most important, I'd say, behind Lordy late game. Basically, it just doubles the bonuses to its attack and health, which means it plays great with Fanny. It becomes a 5/5. It plays great with any kind of buffs you can put on it. If you can get a spell that buffs its health, I think there's a Merlin's Test, gives +3/+3. On this would be +6/+6. The upgraded version gets triple benefits. And of course, it works great with a Lordy, who buffs all your dwarfs in the late game. So that's why Doubly is key to any late game dwarf comp. Because it's basically dwarfs in the late game get huge stat boosts. Doubly benefits doubly from those stat buffs. So Doubly is going to be very good late game. Early game, it's a 1/1. Maybe you can boost it up to a 5/5 or a 7/7, but 1/1's very weak. The average 3 cost is going to be, closer to 4/4, 5/5. And maybe not with those particular stats, but in terms of the value it provides. So unless you have a Fanny or something along those lines to buff it, it's going to be very weak. You need to get it, at least to 3/3 or 4/4 before, it can even be acceptable. So you wouldn't go into dwarfs because you have a Doubly, but getting a Doubly once you're in dwarfs is very, very important. So Bossy just buffs all your other dwarfs by +2/+2. It's, pretty strong. You will put it in the back. Dwarfs don't have a ton of competition for the back row in general, other than Fanny, Bossy, maybe Princess Right. The rest of them can kind of go wherever. Some of them you want up front taking hits, like Angry and Greedy. So it's okay. It's 4/4 of stats, which isn't a great, in combat for, at the 4 gold phase. But giving everything +2/+2 is a pretty big buff. So if you have a lot of dwarfs, especially if you have like Tweedledees or Doublies, it's pretty strong. You won't get it if you're not going dwarfs, but if you are going dwarfs, once you make that transition, this might be one of the ones you stop picking up because it does boof your whole team. Greedy is one of the dwarfs that you might just have because it helps you translate combat. If you're strong enough in combat to win the combats, getting extra gold is a way to push the advantage. basically, part of the game is when you're winning combats, how do you make, that win valuable? Just winning combat means you do some damage, you take no damage. That is good, obviously. You'll win games if you never take damage and do damage. To other people, you'll win the game. But if you want to be the strongest person in the lobby, you have to grow in strength each combat, or as many combats as possible. And one of the ways you do that is by either having your characters permanently grow in stats, or by gaining an econ advantage using something like the prized pig, using something like kitty cut purse, getting some slay to grow your characters, and things along those lines. And greedy can be sort of if you strong otherwise, and you see a greedy just with a different comp, you might buy it just to get a gold or two every combat, and it might be fairly strong if you happen to get to level 4 early or something along those lines. So greedy is something you might have even if you haven't started going dwarfs, and it becomes fairly good once you move into dwarfs, because dwarfs are good at buffing stats. And if you get a big greedy, obviously, you can get, 3, 4, 5 gold in a combat. If it gets upgraded, it gets 2 gold a hit. If you happen to do that, you can start getting quite a bit of gold and really start tripling your characters, getting some treasures. It'll be fantastic. However, it's only a 3/6, doesn't have amazing combat stats if you can't buff it, and if you're behind, it's not going to survive damage, and it's just going to be a 3/6 that sort of looks embarrassing. So, overall, if you have a little bit of an advantage, or if you're going dwarfs, greedy's a fine one to buy, as it helps you transition into stronger units. It's not going to be part of your late game comp, because you generally just want more onboard stats, and greedy is just sort of in combat, it just gets gold, it doesn't give more stats. So that's where greedy lies. Princess White, I call it White all the time, is not actually a dwarf, but is, obviously dwarf synergies. When one of your dwarfs dies, it gets +1/+1 permanently. That's actually fairly strong. If you have, 3 or 4 dwarfs already, if you have a Tweedledee that counts twice, you can, get her to grow by 3, 3, 4, 4 every combat early. In late game, you can get her to grow by, 6, 6 every combat. If you have all your other things are dwarfs and they all happen to die before her, which eventually she'll get very large, so it's possible that you win some fights with just her alone. And when she gets upgraded, she gets 2/2 for every dwarf that dies. And the way you upgrade her is by buying 7 dwarfs. It's, thematically very nice. It's gameplay-wise a little bit tough. Because obviously it costs a lot of gold to buy 7 things. One of the ways you can do it is just by buying tinies and crafties. They basically, you buy for 1 and you can sell them back, or buy for 2 and then you sell them back, so you end up net 1 gold, or negative 1 gold, but you move the quest along. Upgrading her is definitely a priority. You get a level 4 treasure, and she starts growing twice as quickly, and that's very, very strong. So she's one of the reasons I get into dwarfs. If I see an early Princess White, and I happen to have a couple dwarfs lying around, I often say, okay, well, she'll be something that will scale her own power, and I can start moving into dwarfs, which will help her scale quicker, and I'll get the level 4 treasure, and level 4 treasure is pretty strong, and there's a dwarf-specific level 4 treasure that we'll get to that's extremely strong. So she is one of the reasons, her and Lordy, I'd say, are the 2 reasons why we'd move towards dwarfs. And if you see her early, that might be an indication that you want to grab her, especially if you already have a couple dwarfs lying around, just because you bought a Tweedledee, or because your first buy was tiny, or something along those lines. Next up, I think this is the only 5-drop, is Angry. Angry, when it survives damage, gives all your dwarfs +2/+2. It's a 4/10, so it's a decent-sized body. Angry is very good in combat late game. If you have, when you have your late game board, the optimal ones are going to include Lordies and Doublies for the most part, but an Angry can be very, very good as well. It's the only dwarf that has a real good combat ability that works. Tweedledee also does, but because dwarfs get their buffs from Lordy at the beginning of combat, the spawn doesn't get buffed, so the spawn isn't super effective, so Tweedledee doesn't really count as a combat ability, I'd say. Angry's also very good with the Falling Stars spell or the Ring of Meteors. It would just give everything +2/+2 right at the start of the fight. It's also great for countering some things. If your opponent has like an Ancient Sarcophagus, or they have an Exploding Mittens, every time one of those triggers, it will give all your dwarfs +2/+2. Even a mummy, I think it's called a, oh, and I don't remember the name, but it deals 4 damage to all opposing characters. So if they trigger that and you have an angry, you'll all take 4 damage, but it will give everything +2/+2, and if it's upgraded, it actually gives +4/+4, so it almost completely counters that ability, and you end up sort of positive. But this is really good against mittens, really good against sarcophagus. If it just takes some hits, everything starts growing. It's, every time you take a 3 damage hit on the angry, you get 2/2 in stats, which will be, roughly 14/14, and it has a 1 in 7 chance. So basically there's a 1 in 7 chance of it being hit and giving 14/14 in stats, which is, fairly significant, and will make it so the sarcophagus on average doesn't take out your board, just over the course of the long run. I guess it, does do, the attack doesn't help it survive, but either, if you ever play sarcophagus against angry, you know you're in a bit of trouble, and it's even better against exploding mittens. So angry can really counter a lot of things, is very strong in combat. Remember, your doublies get double bonus, and when Doubly is upgraded to triple, you get triple bonus, so we'll get 12/12 from an upgraded angry. So angry is one of the late game dwarfs that you're going to be going for. If you see an angry and you have a couple dwarfs, that might be a transition point, but of course angry is only good if you have other dwarfs. So like all dwarfs, and that's one of the reasons that dwarfs play so simply all the time, is because they're all good with other dwarfs, or all the ones that are dwarf-centric are just good with other dwarfs. There's not a lot of cross synergies, so it's very clear what you want to do most of the time. And finally, we get to Lordy. Lordy is the reason dwarfs have a late game. At the start of the battle, at the start of the brawl, give your dwarfs +2/+2 for each dwarf you have. That means if you have 7 dwarfs, each of your dwarfs will get +14/+14. When this is upgraded, it will instead be +28/+28. That means all your doublies, we'll get either the 28/28 or 56/56, triplies, 84/84. So very, very strong. This is how you get the big stat ball that Dwarfs turns into a late game, and this is the other reason, other than Princess White, that I go Dwarfs. I've had games where, I've had a Polywoggle, and I've got a trigger on level 5. It turned into a Lordy, and I just said, okay, we're going Dwarfs. We throw everything, overboard, and we build that comp because it's so strong. It puts so many stats on board when you have, a board full of Dwarfs, and when it's upgraded, it's incredibly powerful. And it applies at the start of combat, which is important because it doesn't require it to survive. Sometimes you'll be tempted to hide it in the back because we tend to sort of put most valuable things in the back, but you can actually just put Lordy up front because once it applies its buff, it's done its job. So Lordy is the key to the late game. If you don't have a Lordy, I just don't think you can play late game dwarfs pretty much at all. I think everything's just too much weaker. So what pulls you into dwarfs? As we talked about, Lordy will pull you into dwarfs because if you get a Lordy, buying more dwarfs is just huge stat buff. Princess White is something you go earlier, and if you see her, then you can sort of pivot around. If you don't have a comp, you can say, this is how I'm going to build further into dwarfs, if you get, especially if you get it early and you just want to get to that quest. Now, the other thing that really pulls me into dwarfs is if I have a couple dwarfs and I see a dwarven forge, because what that does is say you only need 2 copies of a dwarf to upgrade, and it's sort of obvious when I say it, but that includes Lordy. So that means that you can upgrade a 6 cost minion, 6 cost character by just getting 2 copies, which is very powerful. You think of, so Wonder Waddle is probably the most powerful or, top tier character in the game, and what that does is let your animals that are level 2 and 3 upgrade with just 2 copies, and that's very, very strong. This does a similar thing with dwarfs, so it means you get more treasures, it means you get more upgraded characters which are more powerful, and it means it's cheaper to upgrade them, meaning you can do more rolling and you can buy more other dwarfs. So this is the other reason. Now, if you get a Deep Stone Mine, it gives all your dwarfs +2/+2. It's only a 3-drop power. And you can compare it to Power Orb, which gives all your characters +1/+1, and it's obviously twice as strong as that if you have a board full of dwarfs. So, and Doubly benefits twice from it, Tweedledee benefits twice from that. angry, buffing an angry or buffing a greedy is very strong. There's some dwarfs that in particular are very strong if they get buffed, so it works well with that. I wouldn't say that pulls me into dwarfs. I'm more likely just to grab a deep stone mine if I have a couple dwarfs on board and use it for the value, and then move into dwarfs if I continue seeing things. But I won't go dwarf specifically because I just see a deep stone mine and nothing else. Whereas the other characters, even if I'm not in dwarfs and I see one of those, if I haven't decided on a comp, if my comp hasn't come together, I might grab them and move into them. So I would say Lordy, Princess White, and Dwarven Forge are the reasons I would move into dwarfs. What are the strengths and weaknesses of dwarfs? Strength, first of all, put a lot of stats on the board. Dwarfs just sort of get big, and they can win combats by virtue of just being bigger than other things. There's nothing really fancy about it. They get their buffs at the beginning of the combat, and they just start rumbling, and sometimes that's just enough to win. But, they put a fair amount of stats. Second of all, other than Lordy and Doubly, the rest of the comp is very flexible. You can just sort of have Lordies, a couple Doublies or Triplies, and then any other dwarfs, and you'll be pretty strong. Obviously, Angries and Bossies provide a little bit extra, but if you don't find those, you won't notice a huge drop-off just having Tinies and Luckies and Fannies or whatever. Doubly and Lordy are the key. Once you get those, as many as possible, the rest is sort of interchangeable, and that means that it's not reliant on super specific things other than those two. Third, the dwarf-specific treasures that we looked at above, the Dwarven Forge and the Deepstone Mine, are pretty strong. Getting +2/+2 on, at level 3 is very strong. Making only 2 to upgrade is very strong, and you can actually replace that easily. Say you've upgraded most of your board, and you just get a Lordy, you get the second Lordy, you can just replace it with a level 6 treasure, and now you have another combat treasure. So it's one of those treasures that lets you get value out of it and then replace it. There's some treasures that need to be in your little treasure bank, I guess, to continue giving value, but there are some, like Dwarven Forge, that once you upgrade stuff, and it actually helps you upgrade stuff, you can replace it and you have already gotten the value, and that value continues to exist even after you replace it. And finally, dwarves are pretty resilient to spells, because, late game the most powerful spells are going to be, in most cases, I think Pigomorph, and sometimes the 30 damage one. Dwarfs get a lot of stats, so the 30 damage one isn't likely to kill anything. And Polymorph, or the Pigomorph, will turn something into a 10/10. Obviously, you can't avoid that. However, since Lordy gives everything stats at the beginning of combat, you don't need anything to still be alive in order to, have your board work. The person that gets Pigomorphed will be weak, but everything else will still be as strong as you expected. Obviously if it hits a Doubly, you lose a little bit more stats than you'd otherwise lose, but in general, there's no sort of bear stain to lose. There's no, Echo Wood that you need to get buff. There's nothing you're relying on staying alive. There's nothing you need to hide in the back. It just doesn't really matter what, Pigomorph is bad, but it's sort of equally bad. There's nothing that's sort of backbreaking. And I think that's a strength of dwarfs. You don't have the RNG factor of, oh, I hope they don't Pigomorph my good boy, and then I don't get the buffs, and then my team comp falls apart. Something on those lines. What are the weaknesses? It's just a pile. The dwarfs are just a pile of stats. If someone has a bigger pile of stats, you'll lose. If they have a dwarf comp and have more Lordies than you lose. Like, that's just what happens. You don't have any fancy tricks. You don't have Cupids or Medusas to try to turn the tides. You can't sort of, put a baby bear first with a +100 sword and get 3 trades out of it. It just doesn't, if you don't have more stats than the opponent, you're going to lose the fight, because that's all they do, and barring some lucky attacks. It doesn't function well without Lordy. If you don't have a Lordy, you just can't do anything in the late game. Lordy is so strong with dwarfs that, for balance reasons, the other dwarfs are sort of balanced around the fact that you can have a Lordy in the late game. If you don't have one, you just won't get enough stats out of anything else, and you won't function. Mid game, you don't need it. The other characters are reasonable enough. Princess White can be fine, but late game you need a Lordy. And finally, the characters aren't particularly strong outside the comp. There's a couple that might be worth buying otherwise, but in general, they are pretty weak, so you don't just sort of accidentally buy them in the way you might just buy, say, a random baby bear, and then find the bear stain later, or find the good boy later. Um, it's not particularly strong to just get a random lucky, so you're unlikely to end up with just luckies lying around in the same way you might with, characters that are better individually. So, how to build dwarf comps? So late game or mid game, let's say. Early game you don't really have comps. Early game you have just characters. You're just trying to fill up your board with 7 characters, put some stats on board. Mid game, you know, this is probably so mid game when we're talking about that, we're talking about sort of levels 3, 4, and sort of the beginning of 5. Mid game, you just either have a Princess White, or maybe you've got in the Dwarven Forge, you just have a couple upgraded dwarfs. That's the entire build. You might grab an Angry, that might be sort of your first level 5, and that'll be strong. But mid game, if you're transitioning to dwarfs, it's basically because there's a Princess White or a Dwarven Forge, and you just have a few upgraded dwarfs, and that's your entire board. Doublies aren't very good unless you start having some bossies lying around, or some angries, and you sort of hide the doubly in the back. But in general, doubly won't be something you're drawn to. So mid game, you're just gonna have sort of a set of dwarfs, and then Princess White. Eventually, you'll transition into angries and doublies, and then finally, you'll need to find a Lordy. Late game, you're just going for Lordies, doublies, and then trying to fill out whatever you can't find with angries. It might be optimal to have some angries in there instead of doublies, and instead of doublies, I think Lordies are always going to be the best. If you could just fill up the board with Lordies, I think you'd do that. But it's possible there's some math involved where angry might be better, but in general, get Lordies, get doublies, and you'll be strong. One thing to note is, and I think this is important, Princess White, because she isn't herself a dwarf, can sort of factor into some things in some weird ways. Generally, she'll be your biggest character by far because she grows every combat by a pretty significant amount. So if you've had her for a while, and she's getting +6/+6, or she gets upgraded, she starts getting, +10/+10, +12/+12 every fight, she'll be very large. You'll end up with a, 60/60 Princess White a decent amount of the time. However, when you start getting Lordies, it's possible that even though she'll be by far your biggest character, because she's not a dwarf, she'll reduce the buffs your other dwarfs get, and it might be best to replace her with just a random dwarf. Because an upgraded Lordy gives +28/+28 to every dwarf, right? And each additional dwarf you add increases the bonus by +4/+4 when Lordy is upgraded. That means that by having a non-dwarf in there, you're reducing the bonus to everything else, and the non-dwarf is not itself getting the bonus, which means if you take the stats in the aggregate, even if it's a pretty large minion, it might be reducing your overall stats. And Princess White, although it grows over time, so she herself grows, it doesn't benefit in fights from the angries, it doesn't benefit from the bossies, so it's possible that it just won't be strong in the late game, and it might need to be replaced. But it's going to be your most powerful early game unit if you get it early, so just keep an eye out for that late game, try to do the math and say, what am I, don't get attached to it. It's very easy to get attached to it. I'm always so hesitant to sell it because it's one of my favorite units, but you have to be able to transition off of her if that's what the situation dictates. And final note I just wanted to make is about Hi-Ho. Hi-Ho is a 4-cost spell that gets a random dwarf and then give all your dwarfs +1/+1. Obviously giving you dwarfs +1/+1 is, really good. It's a Blessing of Athena, which is a 4-cost spell, and this one gives you a random dwarf, which could cost anywhere between 2 and 6. This doubly gets double value. Because dwarf comps don't care a ton about what dwarfs you have often, if you see this when you already have like a Princess White and you're not looking for any specific dwarfs, this is fine to grab. It will give you some stat buff, and it will just give you the dwarf to fill in your board. Late game, it's okay. It can help you maybe get a cheaper Lordy or just find a Lordy, but if you can't control what you get, so if your board is already filled with dwarves, it might be time just to give this a pass. The +1/+1 is fine, but dwarfs are already just a pile of stats, so the marginal benefit of just the 1/1 isn't huge. You're not really, unless you're reaching a break point, it's not going to matter too much. Either your things are going to, win the combats or they're not. So don't get too attached for it, but it is a dwarf-specific spell, so I think it's worth talking about here. So that's basically the dwarf comp. I hope that gives an idea of how to play it. These are all the dwarfs available and sort of the dwarf-specific items. Dwarfs, I think, have more specific treasures than most other things, although I guess there's some crossover. One final note about dwarfs is they don't have any alignment. So there aren't as many crossover comps with dwarfs as there are with other things. You don't have, evil dwarfs or good dwarfs, so you can't just throw in a good boy, or you can't just put them in a comp with a sarcophagus. You can't even make them a different alignment with spells. If you can make a good character into an evil and evil into good, but you can't do that with neutral characters. So dwarfs are a comp that just basically wants you to buy dwarfs and play dwarfs, and that's the whole thing. So you're not going to find, a dwarf plus something else comp very often, which sort of leads you down the path of just buy a bunch of dwarfs, which is what you want to be doing anyways. So it's an easy way for, if you're just starting out and you want to get a sense for what, comps are worthwhile, or, how comps play out. I think dwarfs is a good thing to get into. And like I said, I won my first couple games with it, and, I've probably won, 10 or so games with dwarfs overall out of, probably 80 wins. So I think dwarfs is very strong. It definitely has its weaknesses. It's a little bit, just stat ball-y, but if you're looking to get into it, I hope this helps explain how to work it, and I hope you like these videos. I'm going to make a few more on the other comps, which get a little bit more complicated, but I thought this would be a good starting point. Thank you.